Hello everybody, I'm Steve Kress. I'm the Vice President for Bird Conservation of the National Audubon Society and Director of Project Puffin. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about hummingbirds this afternoon, one of my favorite topics for sure. The idea of my speaking about hummingbirds when I'm actually a puffin enthusiast is fun because I'm also excited about backyard birds and attracting birds to backyard habitats. So I'm at the Laboratory of Ornithology at Cornell University now, where my winter office is. In the summer I'll migrate up to the coast of Maine to be with the puffins and the hummingbirds. But we only have one there, the ruby-throated hummingbird. So we have some questions and that you've posed, and I'll just go through those questions and try to answer them for you. And please send in more questions if you have some, and we'll just keep this going for a while. So the first question I have here is, Allen's hummingbirds are non-migratory. Is that true of all hummingbirds? So I have to qualify that a little bit, because actually some Allen's hummingbirds are migratory. There is a small population that breeds on the Channel Islands and in the Los Angeles area that is non-migratory, but most of them migrate. The ones in Northern California, the ones that breed north to the Southern Oregon coast, they are migratory. They fly to Mexico for the winter. Then they fly over the Los Angeles population, heading back to their breeding grounds. Now, most hummingbirds are relatively short migrants. Of the some 18 species that breed in the United States, most of them are in the southwestern states. Most of them are short distance migrants. Hummingbirds also migrate up and down mountains vertically as well as latitudinally. And there's a couple of real exceptions. The greatest migrants are the rufous hummingbird that winters in Mexico but flies over the United States all the way up to the southern United States, up to Alaska, where it has its breeding areas. The ruby-throated hummingbird is equally a grand flyer from Central America. It flies over the Gulf of Mexico, then flies up across the eastern United States, some of them ending up in the Maritimes of Canada. So hummingbirds are great migrants, and other hummingbirds don't. Migration happens because birds have to migrate. They won't go through the risks of migration unless there's advantages that exceed the risks of staying put. And one can say that about all bird migration. That's why most birds in North America have some migration, either short or long. Some of them are remarkable, hummingbirds especially. Another question here posed is, what is the role of the male hummingbird? Of course, every female needs a male for obvious reasons. Most hummingbirds are have a promiscuous mating system. Unlike monogamous birds like puffins, which typically have the same mate for year after year after year and may live to be as much as 35 years old, hummingbirds are much shorter lived, and they don't have that system at all. What their system is all about, their mating system, is that the male will try to perform and attract a female. The dance that the male hummingbird does, the flight dance, is unique to each species, and the shape of the flight pattern is unique. Now, the females watch the males do this dance, and they determine which of them are going to be the best likely mate to mate with. One can only assume that things to consider if you were a female hummingbird would be maybe the height of the flight, maybe the frequency of the flight, maybe the sounds that are produced during the flight. Hummingbirds are not noted songbirds, but they do chirp and squeak, and they make that incredible sound with their wings. You know, hummingbird wings are remarkably fast. They can move their wings as fast as 200 wing beats per second. And when wings are moving that fast, it makes the loud hum that we think of how hummingbirds got their name. So the male is a performer for the female. Once they copulate, the male keeps on dancing, and the female then moves on to do the rest of the reproductive season. She builds the nest, incubates the eggs, feeds the chicks, and the male just keeps dancing. And a good season for him is many different matings. Another question that we have here is, how are hummingbirds divided into the different species? Aren't all hummingbirds basically hummingbirds? Well, no, they're not all the same. There are about 18 species in North America, but that's just a fraction of the number that breed in other countries. There's about 350 species of hummingbirds that are known. They're found only in the New World, most of them in South America. The center of hummingbird diversity is Brazil and Peru, Ecuador. That's where most of the hummingbirds live, in the slopes of the Andes. But as you go further north, there's still lots of hummingbirds right up through Mexico into the southwestern U.S. That's where their population drops off. Hummingbirds are distinct species, just as, say, a cardinal and a blue jay are different species. A ruby-throated hummingbird is different than a Allen's hummingbird. Those two species would not breed. Most hummingbird species will not interbreed. And if they did interbreed, they wouldn't be likely to produce viable offspring. It'd be a mistake to interbreed, and they don't. And it's up to the female really to distinguish that and not to venture near a courting male of the wrong species. So that's what makes a species, is a genetically isolated population of birds that is not going to likely breed with a genetically similar species of bird. Sometimes they look very similar. If you're looking at hummingbirds, especially the females, it's tough to tell them apart. The males are much more distinctive. Remember, like in most birds, the female picks the male, so it's important the males be distinctive colored. That helps to reduce the risk of hybridization, which would be a bad mistake for a female to make, because her offspring wouldn't likely survive, or they would be weakened in some way. So hummingbirds are not all the same. So another question that one of the viewers asked is to please detail the life history of hummingbirds. And it's roughly similar. Hummingbirds, if they're a resident species or if they're a migrant species, they will arrive about the same time. Hummingbirds are famous for arriving migratory species almost to the same day. There are many cases in literature where someone who has been feeding hummingbirds will put a bird feeder out. Well, even before they put the bird feeder out, they may look out their window and see a hummingbird hovering in the very spot where the feeder was the previous year. That only points to the fact that hummingbirds migrate on a schedule, and that schedule is determined more by the length of the day and wind direction than any other time. If hummingbirds, migratory species, got back too early, they would be in trouble because there wouldn't be enough nectar for them to eat. And it's very important that hummingbirds eat constantly. If hummingbirds stop eating, they will die. In fact, you might wonder, how does a hummingbird live overnight? Because it's got to keep eating. Well, one of the tricks hummingbirds have at night is that they actually slow their metabolism down. Their body temperature can drop down by several degrees. They go into a torpor at night, not into a hibernation, but just a slowed down pace where their heartbeat slows down and where their body temperature slows down. They have a body temperature about 105 degrees during the daytime. but that can slow down to less than 100 at night. Once hummingbirds arrive, an interesting thing about hummingbirds, if they do get there a little late, get there a little early before the flowers have opened up in the spring, some of them have learned to co-adapt with yellow-bellied sapsuckers. The sapsuckers arrive usually a week or so before hummingbirds. They're already drilling their holes in trees like birches and sugar maples, and they are creating sap, which they are benefiting from. But the hummingbirds will follow behind those. So that's kind of the backup plan, is to find a sapsucker. If you're a hummingbird that got caught in a cold snap, they would be in big trouble if they arrive. So their timing for arrival is very critical for the migratory species, like the rufous and the ruby-throated hummingbird. So once they arrive back, the males start their courtship soon after they arrive, and they will attract the females, and the females will mate, and the females set out to build a nest. The location of the nest depends a little bit about how the various species, and it can be eye level or in a tall tree. Female builds the nest. She will build it out of plant fibers mostly, attached to the site, usually with spider webs for sticky substance. She'll use the spider webs also to put on the outside, and then we'll take moss, or most notably large lichens, and attach that, probably an adaptation for camouflage. The interior of the nest is especially soft plant parts. The ruby-throated hummingbird has been known to collect the fuzz off of cinnamon ferns to line the interior of its nest. And the nests vary from species to species. And they're used just once usually per year. Rarely will they have a second brood. But that's been recorded in some species. The female lays usually 2 eggs and a few days apart, and incubates those eggs herself, 17 to about 22 days. And then it takes about as long to rear the chicks before they can fly. When they leave the nest, like most young birds, they are fully sized. They're about as large as the parents. So if you look out and you see a small hummingbird, it is not a baby hummingbird that will later grow up. It is probably another species of hummingbird. There are a few tiny ones, but none of them are very big in North America. Most of them weigh about 4 grams, less than a nickel in weight. And that's pretty much the year for the hummingbirds. If they are a non-migratory species, they'll spend the rest of the year in the same territory, often defending it. Hummingbirds are famous for being, for their size, very feisty and aggressive toward other hummingbirds. They will sometimes share, sugar water feeders, and that's why you see many of them around. But even there, they can get into fights over flowers. They can be very feisty because it takes a lot of flowers to feed a hummingbird. About 1,500 flowers are often visited in one day. And they've got it down. They know how often to revisit the same flower before the sap or the nectar is diminished. And they guard those flowers. There's a little trap line of flowers. They'll guard them, and if another hummingbird gets too close, they'll chase that other hummingbird away. So that's part of their nature. We think of them as vegetarians sucking nectar, but really, although they do take nectar, they're also very interested in mosquitoes and spiders and other insects, because the protein they get out of those is necessary for raising young. The young require a high protein diet. They won't get it from sugar water. They need nectars. That's why flowers are so important, because the flowers provide both nectar and insects, and spiders and other small invertebrates to feed their young. So I think that's kind of key points about hummingbird life history. Fairly similar as far as the male and female and the incubation, feeding of young goes. Another question I have here is, how do you believe hummers have evolved over the past 1,000 years or so? I'm not sure that a lot of evolution has happened over the past 1,000 years, but certainly hummingbirds have adapted well to people. And that's one of the exciting things about hummingbirds. In that last 1,000 years of change of the North American landscape, it's been drastically changed. The biggest, and there's many problems those changes have created in hummingbirds, but there's also some benefits. Their adaptability to gardens and gardening has made them very popular in backyards. We can talk more about that as we continue this discussion, but there's terrific opportunities for people to help hummingbirds by doing hummingbird gardens. And that's an exciting idea for bird conservation. Hummingbirds need a continuous migratory strip. So when they're migrating, especially up the west coast, if they get over large areas such as parking lots and areas where there's no flowering plants, agricultural areas can be difficult for them as well. They're in trouble. So little oases along the way, oases of flowering plants with sugar, especially native plants, are very important for them. Another question here is, why do certain breeds of birds, like puffins, have males and females very similar in appearance? Other birds, like hummers, etc., have such different colors. Do some birds not need to display for courtship? It's true that the puffins, it's hard to tell them apart. Likewise, most sparrows, you can't really tell them apart. Most ducks, most hummingbirds have very strong sexual dimorphism. Color is not the only way that birds tell each other apart. Color is one of the conspicuous ways that we as humans notice, but there's lots of other ways that birds can tell the sexes apart. Male puffins, for example, have initiate billing displays. The females notice that. There's lots of behavioral displays. And color also is not just what the human eye looks like, but the human birds can see a lot more color in the ultraviolet spectrum than we can. So it's thought, for example, the chickadees actually, even though they look alike to our eyes, if you view them in ultraviolet light, the males have different patterns on them than do the females. So color can vary a lot by the viewer as well as the actual plumage changes. So I'd say the answer to that question is that birds have different ways of showing their sexual behavior, sexual differences. Color and patterns of feathers is the most obvious way, but behaviors work just as well. And that's why sparrows and junk, more variety to the song, because that means he's a survivor. He's been around longer. Therefore, it's better to mate with that male than some upstart who really has a very simple song. I want to take this opportunity to mention a book that I wrote called Hummingbird Gardens. This is part of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden series. There it is. And this book is it's got a section on it about 15 things that you can do to attract hummingbirds. And I start that list of 15 things that you can do, and this would apply everywhere. No matter where you are, you could have these 15 things. It applies everywhere. I would suggest starting with a map of your yard, just a sketch. Draw the sketch where the house is, where the gardens are, and on that sketch, then you can begin to design your yard, especially for hummingbirds. It's amazing the things you can do for hummingbirds. They're very responsive. Much more so than any other bird. I know people that and I've done this myself, I bought a hummingbird plant that is so attractive, I haven't even got it in the ground yet, and hummingbirds are feeding on the plant. That's what I call responsiveness. So with the sketch, you can start to design a hummingbird garden. And you can put it near windows, in window boxes, hanging baskets. If you live in a city and you have access to a rooftop, you can create a hummingbird garden on the rooftop. And of course, if you've got an actual yard, that's even greater opportunities. They can be of any scale, and in that way it's something everybody can do somewhere. Trellises are a terrific addition to a hummingbird garden. You can plant flowers in the ground, then bring them right up the walls of your house on trellises of honeysuckle and campsis, which is trumpet vine, are two things that come in mind. Now, one of the most important things for any kind of bird attracting habitat project is to use native plants. And that, let me talk a little bit about this. This is key to whatever kind of bird you're trying to attract. Natives are important for several reasons. First of all, they have more insects feeding on them than non-native plants. And you might say, that's what? I'm trying to attract birds, not insects. But we're talking not just beautiful insects like butterflies and moths at night, but little insects that eat the leaves and eat the flower petals and are nestled down inside of the flowers. These are what the hummingbirds are after. These are what the warblers and even sparrows and cardinals with big seed-cracking beaks, they all feed their young insects. They require a diet of about 70% protein, and the best way to get that is from insects. So a yard that is loaded with native plants will have more insects. Native plants have more insects because insects have co-evolved with the plants in North America. When plants are brought here from other countries, they come without the complementary insects. And while that might seem appealing to people who want a perfect garden without any insect damage to leaves, that's really not a good idea if you're trying to attract birds, including hummingbirds. They need the insects. So native plants provide more insects. They also withstand temperature extremes of your local habitat. And with our climates changing, becoming drier, becoming wetter, the plants that have been on the ground, locally adapting for long periods, are more likely to survive. So it's a better investment for you to plant native plants. They just have a better chance of surviving if they're adapted to your local areas. And the nutrition that they provide from the nectars that are produced from the plants, from the insects, is better than any kind of domesticated flowers. Some of the domesticated flowers have been bred actually for their blooms rather than for their nectar. Things like columbine, the native columbine, has got a very good nectar crop for hummingbirds, but the cultivated columbines, ones with double petals, colors of purple and white, are not nearly as attractive to hummingbirds, which typically prefer red and orange flowers. So another thing that, a couple of things you can do, you can plant your hummingbirds plants in patches. You can pick species that flower at different seasons of the year. So there's nectar early in the spring, right on through the fall, and you can prune the flowers to get them to double bloom 2 or 3 more times during the year. Some species you want to let don't deadhead too much because you want some seeds for seed eaters, but most of the plants that for nectar really don't produce many seeds anyways. They're producing mostly nectar, and they don't have a lot of seeds. Water is important for hummingbirds like any other kind of bird. They do need water, especially in arid areas, but dripping water features are the best for hummingbirds. And you can just drip them into very shallow pans Hummingbirds in nature often bathe on broad leaves. So taking a garden hose and just spraying your plants down so that the hummingbirds can drink and bathe right on the leaves can be the best thing you can do for hummingbirds. Shrubs and trees are good for all birds, but hummingbirds usually like to breed 10 to 20 feet off the ground. So some large trees are important. And, hummingbirds sometimes show up almost immediately, like I mentioned, but it may take them a while. Once they learn that your backyard is a haven for hummingbirds, they'll keep coming back. They'll keep coming back. And I hope that you'll keep at it, because it takes time to learn about hummingbirds, and it takes time for them to learn about you. And finally, if you want to have a healthy habitat for hummingbirds, back off of any kinds of pesticides and herbicides, because these are toxic not just to the hummingbirds, who are fast-moving, highly tuned little living machines, but they're bad for everything. Your pets, your children, and you. Keep those things off of your land, and you'll have a healthier land. Land that is devoid of insects is going to be devoid of bird songs and the birds that we're trying to attract. So think about this, because we've learned a lot about it, yet still people are spraying more pesticides almost every year, and it's killing thousands of birds in every city. Here's another question. Are hummers able to distinguish a flower by sight, or do they go to a flower based strictly on the color of a particular flower? Well, hummingbirds are, like most birds, very keen about using sight. Their eyesight is phenomenal, and they're looking for foods based on color, not just in our spectrum, which we see, but in the ultraviolet spectrum as well. One thing that differs between attracting hummingbirds and attracting butterflies is that all flowers that are attractive butterflies are well perfumed. They are flowers that they're attracting insects by scent. Hummingbird flowers are not attracting insects by scent. They're attracting insects by just by their color patterns. So color is important. It's often said, you'll hear this, that hummingbirds are attracted to red and orange flowers mostly, and it's true. Some of the native flowers that are most attractive, like the cardinal flower, like some of the honeysuckles that are attractive to hummingbirds, are orange and yellow, but I've seen hummingbirds come to other colors as well. They learn, they've got a terrific memory. If they've found nectar in a flower, they'll quickly return to that flower and look for others like it. There's another question. Has the proliferation of live cams on the internet, like those on explore.org, had an impact on what we know about birds? Yes. I think that the live cams are a terrific new window on nature. They're letting us see things that we've never seen before. I understand that some of the observations around Bella's nest were surprising, and what we're seeing there, and what we've seen with our ospreys on Hog Island at the Audubon camp, where I spend my summers. Who would have guessed that intruders would have come into the nest, and that what we thought was just a simple business of rearing young is actually much more complicated. There's other birds trying to pair up. They're trying to take away nesting opportunities. They're trying to steal food. There's a lot of drama that goes on in bird nests. How would we have ever known this before? When birds are nesting in such out-of-the-way, hidden places. But a bird cam, now, that's a great opportunity to see what's really going on inside a bird nest. There are cameras now inside of even in a puffin burrow like we have in Maine during the summer. I hope that if you haven't seen that, you'll come and visit our puffin cam on CO Island, where we have a camera. It'll go live in the middle of May, and it's underground. You see the puffins coming in and out. You see them incubating and finally the chick. You can watch what the chicks are eating. We'll be counting on people to make observations. It's called citizen science. People make observations. They can report it, take their own pictures. These are all great opportunities. So the cam, especially the high definition streaming videos like explore.org is providing to people are really great. It's new, and it's a revelation for biologists to have these new views to see what's happening. Another question: what environmental or human factor has the most negative effect on the survival of the species as well as that of other birds? So I think the questionnaire is asking what have humans done that is most devastating for hummingbirds? Well, there are many things, unfortunately. Habitat destruction is probably the biggest one, especially for hummingbirds that rely on a continuous availability of food throughout their habitat, and those that are migratory especially. Yes, they can fly for hundreds of miles across the Gulf of Mexico without eating, but once they get to the other side, they've got to do that. Now, that's sort of unique to the ruby-throated. The others really fly over land, and they require the need for replenishment. So taking away natural habitat is a big thing. Replacing that habitat with invasive plants from other countries that don't provide the nectar or the food, or maybe bloom at the wrong season. You know, there's some really beautiful synchrony that goes on in the spring with the opening of flowers. Here in Ithaca, New York, where I am, the arrival of the hummingbirds is almost timed to the day with the opening of the Native American columbine. That system of plant opening and the bird arriving has taken time to evolve to where it's at, but it's really a great system. But if native plants disappear, the reliable foods also disappear, and so too will the hummingbirds disappear. I put on that list also of problems, pesticides. Hummingbirds are very high-tuned little flying machines. You know, they need a lot of food to grow, to fly. They can fly like 66 miles per hour. It's kind of like top speed, but that takes a lot of energy to make that kind of flight. So pesticides can affect their health and their ability to maneuver the way they do. And finally, maybe the biggest change of all that threatens hummingbirds is going to be climate change. The warming of our Earth, warming of the oceans, the timing of arrival of the hummingbirds is probably changing, and so too is the opening of the flowers. So the synchrony I mentioned before is, over time, it's come to be beautifully meshed, but that's going to change and is changing. We have a new program at Audubon called Hummingbirds at Home, and that program is going to engage people everywhere in making observations in their backyards about the arrival times and about the foods that hummingbirds prefer to eat. And it's going to provide tips on how to have a better backyard for hummingbirds. So I hope you'll consider participating in that program. Here's a question: has West Nile virus had any known effect on hummingbirds? I actually got to say I have not heard of any effect on hummers. You know, hummingbirds. It's tough. It would be a tough thing to assess, because when a hummingbird dies, it's like falls down under the shade of some bush or shrub. How many people have ever found a dead hummingbird? I mean, I don't know that I have. One time I found one that died in sleep on a branch, and it became mummified on the branch. It was very strange. Like a year later, was still stuck on that branch. It had mummified there. But if they fell on the ground, it would disappear for sure, and it probably wouldn't know about it. So as far as I know, I've never heard of hummingbirds being affected by it. Larger birds, like raptors and crows especially, are vulnerable, but then they too are more conspicuous when they're found dead. So let's see, any more questions here? Send your questions in, happy to answer them. While we're waiting for more questions, I'll mention that I do my hummingbird watching in Maine during the summer, the Audubon camp on Hog Island, where we have lots of ruby-throated hummingbirds. We have native plants. We also have some sugar water feeders because that brings them into places where people can see them. We are at almost the northern end of their migratory range. Hog Island has 6-day programs for people that have interest in birds. We have a program called Raptor Rapture that is attended mostly by people that got to know the famous ospreys, Rachel and Steve, that live on Hog Island. Other programs for beginning birders and those interested in ornithology. 6-day programs. You don't have to be a pro to come. It's a lot of fun living on an island with other people. So here's some more questions. We witnessed an intruder, Rosie, harassing the chicks and the nest. Is it possible she was trying to drive out competition? So hummingbirds are famous for being feisty and aggressive, and this varies. Some are more so than others, and yes, I think it's quite likely that this bird named Rosie was a more aggressive bird than Bella, who was already incubating on a nest, and Rosie tried to take over the territory. And we see that kind of thing more when we're watching with the cams. It's the kind of thing that probably wouldn't be noticed at all. But when you focus your attention and so many people watching one nest, that kind of thing can be seen. So I think it's quite likely we were seeing crowding and territoriality in place working here. And it can show up, and the rules they operate by may not be like our own, but that's what we see. There's another question. Do you believe that rehabbers should be used in a case such as we witnessed with Rosie and Bella, or do you believe one should allow nature to take its course? Well, I guess my personal view of that is that where we see direct problems that have been caused by humans, I think that humans have some obligation to help out. And whether that was going on here or not, I don't really know. Here's another question. What is your feeling on hummingbird banding? Well, I think that any kind of bird banding should be done for some purpose. And that is why the bird banding office now only gives out banding permits very carefully to people who have demonstrated that they have the skill to band birds, whether it's a hummingbird or an eagle. They have to have a research project in mind. And more those research projects have to have some conservation element. There is much that can be learned from banding. It still remains a very useful tool because without the bands, it's hard to recognize the individuals. There's lots of other ways to mark birds now, and this is a very exciting time for biologists interested in birds, for bird migration. Little devices called geolocators. We're putting these on puffins now. The geolocators are little tags that with puffins are put on the leg, but on a hummingbird they could be attached to their back. They're very, very tiny. They measure day length and time, and with that you get a rough estimate of the latitude and longitude. And this is telling us amazing things about migrations of birds. So I guess the answer to that question is yes. I think bird banding is appropriate if there are specific questions that will be answered, and especially if those questions have some conservation message that could help the population to survive better. Here's a question. I am from Washington, D.C. I usually have about 10 to 15 hummers coming to my feeder, but last year I only saw about 4 or 5. Someone said they did not come here due to high winds. Is this true? Does the wind or storm affect their arrival? Well, hummingbirds are vulnerable to strong winds and storms. I could imagine that during migration, hummingbirds would be very vulnerable as they're crossing the Gulf of Mexico to storms. So that kind of thing can have a big impact at the population level. Storms at the wrong time, especially for rare species, especially for those that fly in flocks. They've been known for the large numbers have been killed in migration. So whether that's happening locally or not, I would wonder about other causes, and that sounds pretty speculative that it was high winds. It could easily be the local population being poisoned by herbicides in somebody's nearby garden. I don't know, but there's lots of possibilities why a local population might not be returning. If it happened just one year, perhaps it was something to do with weather patterns. But hummingbirds are great flyers, and the wind generally, if they're alive, generally the wind means would only slow them down maybe by a few days and coming back. Here's another question. I recently started a hummingbird garden on my balcony. Great idea. Any chance they'll run off the pesky pigeons that try to nest out there every spring? I doubt it. Honestly, sorry. Pesky pigeons are a different species. They're not competing with the hummingbirds for anything. The hummingbirds are more likely to run off each other than they are the pesky pigeons. And maybe there's other ways to manage the pigeons if you're trying to keep them off. But I wouldn't count on hummingbirds helping with that. No, I don't see why they would. Here's another question. What, in your estimation, are the key points a bird will use in determining if eggs are non-viable? So, usually in nature, most eggs are viable. It's rare that an egg doesn't hatch because it's not viable. It may not hatch because the parents stayed away from it for too long. And if that's the case, it could chill down and the embryo might die inside. But fertilization in nature is pretty effective. The males are very good at what they do. And most eggs, particularly for a large population of birds, the males are available and the eggs are viable. If an egg is not going to hatch for whatever reason, the female generally would eventually give up. She would probably incubate the normal course in hummingbirds, 21 days is the max, or 22 days, but I would guess by 30 days she'd give up and maybe build another nest somewhere else. If the eggs disappeared, she might relay eventually in that same nest, and eggs do disappear. Lots of things will take them. Predatory birds, such as grackles and jays. Chipmunks, it turns out, are nest predators. They climb up in the nest. Cute little chipmunks. Yep. And red squirrels, they will also take bird eggs. Have nest snakes, of course, so a hummingbird can lose eggs for lots of reasons, would then need to re-nest. Here's a question. It says, Rosie appeared to go through the motions of feeding Bella's chicks. Why would she do that? Was it another way of her trying to take over the territory? So birds often do feed young in another bird's nest. Sometimes even other species. A bird that has the maternal instinct or paternal instinct, because males often in many species feed as well. And the chicks will beg from anything that lands on nests. So before a baby bird's eyes open, it knows that there's a parent in the nest when it gets a slight vibration. So if a parent lands on the rim of the nest, whether it's the real parent or the intruder, the babies may open their beaks and beg, and that may release the feeding behavior. I don't think, if that happened, I don't think that the parent was in some way trying to chase off or discourage the chicks in any way. They probably just had a little bit of instinctive feeding behavior still, and the chicks had an instinctive begging behavior. So these, again, are the great kinds of things you see in nature. A picture I saw in a National Geographic book many years ago, there was a goldfish gaping at the surface of a goldfish pond, with his mouth open to the surface, and a cardinal was trying to feed it. Now, clearly that cardinal was fooled by the gaping behavior and the orange color inside of the goldfish's mouth that mimicked the gaping pattern inside of a baby cardinal's mouth. Its instinctive behavior, it was in breeding condition, was to feed that gaping mouth, even though it was a fish. Now, was the fish doing that to get food? Maybe not. It may have been looking for oxygen, being at the surface as goldfish do. But I wouldn't put it past, if the fish was in fact rewarded by being at the surface, it might start coming up. Fish are pretty smart too. So it could happen more often, but whether the parent would keep doing it long enough to make a difference or have that happen, that's probably stretching it a bit. But strange things happen like that, and strange things happen in hummingbird nests too, and we're just so fortunate that we have the opportunity to see them with this Explorer camera. Here's another question. We have quite a few hummingbirds around our house. One, an Anna's, has built a nest in our patio. Terrific. Her chicks have just hatched. Since they will be gone soon, and it's still early in the year, what is the likelihood that she will use the nest again this year? I don't think that hummingbirds usually reuse the same nest, but I think it has been recorded. So I would say that it's possible. In general, birds don't like to reuse nests, and that's because there are nest parasites, particularly after the first brood, that could affect the nesting success of the second brood. So birds really don't use nests from one year to the next in general for that reason. In the same year, occasionally they do, particularly if it's a non-migratory species. So when a hummer has chicks, will she then share her territory with those chicks? Once they mature, will she chase them away at some point? So I think that once the chicks leave and they're on their own, they are probably going to move out of that territory, and they're going to set up their own territory nearby, and they'll get away from where the parent is. And I wouldn't be surprised if the parent would chase them away just like any other hummingbird, because they would be competing for food that the parent would need, and also that it would need to feed its chicks. Again, this goes back to the defense of the food reserves. There was an interesting research study one time that measured the frequency of feeding of hummingbirds along the trap line of hummingbird flowers, and it showed that the more hummingbirds were in an area, the more frequently the territory hummingbird would make the rounds. As the number of migratory hummingbirds diminished, then the frequency of visits diminished. So that just reinforces the idea that hummingbirds are quite eager to defend their territories, chase away intruders that would take nectar out of their trap line of flowers. Remember, 1,500 flowers per day may be visited to keep a hummingbird satiated. And lots of chicks in the area would probably just interfere with that. Okay. Here's another question. Everything I've read makes a reference to it being illegal to have possession of a hummer's nest. Can you explain why this is? So it is illegal to collect bird nests. It's illegal to collect bird eggs and feathers. And this is because of the history of the millinery trade and bird collecting in general in this country. Back in the Victorian period of the late 1800s, it was quite the trendy thing to do to collect hummingbirds and other kinds of birds, to mount them as taxidermy mounts for the decorations of people's homes, and to even mount them in hats, and to collect their eggs into egg collections and nests as well. So to stop that, laws were passed. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is the most notable one of 1916. It's a treaty because it includes protection in Canada and in Mexico for migratory birds. And so these laws were passed to stop that. And it may seem extreme now that, a nest is not going to get used again, or eggs that are addled can't be kept. But to prevent the collection of nests from under active nesting birds, and to taking active live eggs, and to kill birds for the purposes of decoration, these laws are passed, and I think it's a good thing. Permits can be obtained for educational purposes, so teachers and others that have valid reasons to have these collections of native birds can still have them. And most of those museums and nature centers that have the proper permits for collections, I've found them quite willing to let people come and look at and use those specimens for art projects and subjects for creativity. So that's the reason. That's why it's illegal. So I just want to encourage people to take some time to visit the Audubon site called Hummingbirds at Home, and to think about things you can do in your backyard. Because when you're creating a safe habitat for hummingbirds, you're also creating a great habitat for all kinds of migratory birds and resident species that need good habitat. Remember when I was asked what's the biggest problem people had? It is reshaping the face of North America. And just over 100 years, we've really transformed it, and we've had a huge effect on birds. A recent Audubon study of the effect of climate change on birds has shown that 317 species, it's about half of all the birds in North America, are either already are or soon will be affected by our warming climate and shifts in the amount of rainfall that we're seeing. So what can you do? It's sort of overwhelming to think about the scope of the problem, but one of the things we can do is create bird-friendly habitats in our backyards. If you love hummingbirds, help the hummingbirds, and you'll help a whole suite of birds as well. You can learn more about birds, and that's important. Lots of places on the internet. The new Audubon website is a great spot to visit. There's a field guide section that is a very exciting place. Come to Hog Island, where I am during the summer. I'd be happy to share our beautiful summer setting with you and learn about birds there as well. There's this little book that I mentioned before, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden book. Another book that I've written that's a broader topic is the Audubon Guide to Attracting Birds. That covers native plants for all kinds of birds, nesting structures, water features, some great ideas for habitat, hummingbird habitats, and that can be a good place to start, a great resource. So I hope that you found this chat helpful. I hope you've learned a few things, and I hope to see you again on the Explore.org cameras. Thank you.